The sword felt heavier than it had in 40 years of service. I stood in the armory of our fortress at Saft, my hands trembling as I tried to lift the blade that had once moved like an extension of my own will, and I could not raise it above my waist. My arms, which had swung this weapon through 100 battles, which had defended pilgrims and held walls and struck down enemies without number, simply would not obey. The steel clattered to the stone floor, the sound echoing through the empty chamber like the tolling of a funeral bell. I was 62 years old. My body was failing, and the Saracen army that had been spotted 3 days' march from our walls would not care that I had once been the finest swordsman in the order, that I had served faithfully since I was 20, that my devotion to my vows remained absolute, even as my flesh betrayed me. Brother Commander Matthias found me there an hour later, sitting on the bench amid the weapons I could no longer wield, and his face told me he already knew what I had discovered about myself, what I could no longer deny. My name is Geoffroi de Chartres, and I took the white mantle of the temple in the year of our Lord 1198, a young man burning with zeal to serve God in the liberation of the Holy Land. I was the second son of a wealthy merchant, educated in letters and numbers, trained in arms by the best masters my father's gold could purchase. I could read Latin and Greek, could calculate figures that made other men's heads spin, could fight on foot or horseback with equal skill. The order welcomed me not just as another sword, but as someone who could serve in multiple capacities, as warrior, as administrator, as diplomat when the situation required someone who could speak to kings and sultans with equal facility. I spent my first decade in Outremer fighting in the campaigns that followed the Third Crusade, standing beside Richard the Lionheart at Arsuf, defending Jaffa against Saladin's counterattacks, learning the brutal arithmetic of war in a land where every advantage was temporary and every victory purchased with blood that could never be fully repaid. Those were my years of glory, if glory is the right word for what we did. The years when my body was strong and my faith was simple and the purpose of my life seemed clear and unquestionable. But warfare is a young man's trade, and as I aged, I found myself assigned increasingly to administrative duties, to the management of the order's vast holdings, to the negotiation of truces and treaties, to the quiet labor of maintaining the infrastructure that allowed our warrior brothers to fight. I told myself this was good service, that not every knight could spend his entire life in combat, that the order needed men who could think as well as fight, who could preserve what we had built rather than simply defend it. For 20 years I served this way, moving between our fortresses, managing estates, overseeing the training of young knights, using my mind more than my sword. I grew comfortable in this role, almost forgot the warrior I had been, allowed my body to soften slightly, my reflexes to slow. And then 5 years ago, when I was 57, I was assigned to Saft, to the great fortress in the mountains of Galilee, and I discovered that comfortable service was about to end, that the life I had built was going to demand one more transformation I was not certain I could make. Saft was not a comfortable posting. It was a frontier fortress, constantly threatened, manned by 200 brothers who knew they stood between the Saracen-controlled interior and the Christian holdings on the coast. The commander, Brother Matthias, was a hard man shaped by 30 years of unrelenting conflict, and he had no patience for knights who could not fight. When I arrived with my letters of assignment, my reputation as an administrator and diplomat, my assumption that I would continue the comfortable service I had grown accustomed to, he looked at me with something between contempt and pity. "We have enough clerks," he said bluntly. "We need warriors. Every man in this fortress must be able to stand a wall when the assault comes, must be able to fight when the enemy breaks through our defenses. Can you do that, Brother Geoffroi? Or should I send you back to Jerusalem where aging knights can be useful without endangering those who depend on them?" His words stung, but they also woke something in me I had thought dormant, some old pride, some memory of who I had been before comfort dulled my edges. "I can fight," I told him, though I was not entirely certain it was true. He put me back into training like a raw recruit, assigned me to drill with the sergeants, made me stand watches on the walls through the cold mountain nights, forced me to remember what it meant to be a warrior rather than a comfortable administrator. It was hard, harder than I wanted to admit. My body, which had once been so responsive, so quick to obey my will, now complained at every exertion, took longer to recover from each session, showed me daily that the years had taken more than I realized. But I persevered, driven by pride and duty, and the need to prove to Matthias and to myself that I was still a Templar Knight, still capable of fulfilling the vows I had taken 40 years earlier. Gradually, painfully, I regained some of what I had lost. Not the speed or strength of my youth, but a competence, a reliability, an ability to stand my post and do what was required. I thought I had succeeded, thought I had proven myself still worthy of the white mantle. And then 3 days ago, the pain started in my hands, a burning sensation that made it difficult to grip anything, and by yesterday I could barely hold a cup, and this morning I discovered I could no longer lift my sword. Brother Matthias sat beside me in the armory, his scarred hands folded, his expression unreadable. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. I showed him my hands, the way they trembled, the weakness that made even simple movements difficult. "I do not know what has happened," I said, hearing the fear in my own voice. "Yesterday I was fine, or fine enough. Today I can barely grip anything, and the sword—" I gestured toward where it lay on the floor. "I cannot fight, Brother Commander. My body has betrayed me at the moment when you need every able man on those walls." I expected anger, expected him to send me away immediately, to tell me I was useless now, a burden the fortress could not afford. Instead, he was quiet for a long time, then spoke with unexpected gentleness. "You are not the first aging warrior to face this, Brother Geoffroi. The body fails. That is the nature of mortality, the price we pay for living long enough to see our strength decline. The question is what we do when we can no longer serve in the way we once did, how we find meaning when the role that defined us is no longer available." He continued, "A Saracen army approaches, perhaps 5,000 men, perhaps more. They will lay siege to these walls within the week. We are 200 brothers and 300 sergeants and men-at-arms. We will be outnumbered 10 to 1, and every man who cannot fight is a mouth we must feed without gaining the sword we need to hold our defenses. I should send you away, back to Jerusalem or Acre, somewhere you can be useful without being a liability. That would be the practical decision, the one that serves the fortress's needs." He paused, and I waited for the dismissal I knew was coming. The end of my service, it safed. Perhaps the end of my service as a warrior entirely. "But I am not going to send you away," he said, and I looked at him in confusion. "You took vows, Brother Geoffroi. Those vows do not expire when your body fails. They bind you until death, and they require service in whatever form you can provide. If you cannot fight, then you will serve in other ways. We have wounded to tend, supplies to manage, 1,000 tasks that need capable hands and a working mind. Will you serve thus? Will you keep your oath even when keeping it means surrendering the pride of standing on those walls with a sword in your hand?" I wanted to refuse, wanted to say that service without combat was not truly service, that if I could not fight then I was useless, that my vows meant nothing if I could not fulfill them in the way I had always understood them. But even as the words formed in my mind, I recognized them as lies born of pride, as the same kind of thinking that made young knights believe only glorious death in battle mattered, that anything less than martial heroism was somehow shameful. Brother Matthias was right. My vows did not depend on my ability to lift a sword, did not expire when my strength failed, did not become void simply because I could no longer serve in the way I preferred. I had sworn poverty, chastity, obedience, service to the order and to God. Those vows remained binding whether I held a sword or a quill, whether I stood on walls or tended wounded, whether my service was glorious or humble. "I will serve," I told him, my voice thick with emotions I could not fully name. "In whatever capacity you require. My oath does not end simply because my body has failed. They put me in charge of the infirmary, of organizing the supplies we would need when the siege began, of preparing to care for the wounded who would inevitably come when the fighting started. It was work, I knew. I had managed similar operations during my years as an administrator, but it felt different now. Felt like exile from the real work of defending the fortress, like being set aside while others did the important labor of holding walls and turning back assaults. I tried not to let my bitterness show, tried to focus on the tasks before me. But every time I saw the other brothers training on the walls, every time I heard the clash of practice swords in the courtyard, I felt the loss like a physical wound. I was no longer one of them, no longer a warrior, no longer worthy of the title I had carried for 4 decades. I was something else now, something diminished, and I did not know how to reconcile myself to this new reality, how to find meaning in service that felt like consolation rather than true purpose. The siege began on a Thursday morning, the Saracen army arriving with their siege engines and their thousands of warriors surrounding our fortress, cutting us off from any possibility of reinforcement or retreat. I watched from the infirmary window as they deployed, as they began the work of breaking our walls and our will, and I felt useless, irrelevant, condemned to watch while others fought. The first assault came that afternoon, and the first wounded came to the infirmary minutes later. Brothers with arrow wounds, with cuts from blades, with broken bones from falling stones. I worked on them with hands that barely functioned, struggling to tie bandages, to hold instruments, to do the simple physical tasks that the infirmary needed help with. Brother Dominic, who ran the infirmary, watched me struggle for an hour before pulling me aside. "You cannot do this work," he said, not unkindly. "Your hands will not allow it, but you can do other things. You can keep records, can track supplies, can talk to the wounded and keep them calm while we work on them. Do that, Brother Geoffroi. Find ways to serve that use what you still possess rather than what you have lost." So I became a record keeper and a companion to the dying, sitting with wounded brothers who would not survive, talking to them, praying with them, holding their hands, which I could still manage barely, as they passed from this world to whatever lay beyond. It was hard work in ways I had not anticipated, not physically demanding but emotionally exhausting, requiring me to witness suffering I could not alleviate, to provide comfort when what these men needed was healing I could not give. But it was also work that mattered, I discovered. The brothers who died with someone beside them, who did not face that final darkness alone, who heard prayers and familiar words in their last moments, their deaths were easier than those who died alone, and I could give them that gift even if I could give them nothing else. I began to understand that service took many forms, that my vows could be fulfilled in ways I had never considered during all those years when I measured my worth by how well I fought, by how many enemies I killed, by how fearsome I appeared in combat. The siege ground on for weeks, the Saracen forces pressing constantly against our walls, wearing us down through relentless assault and the slow attrition of supplies and men. Our numbers dwindled. 200 brothers became 180, then 160, the infirmary filling with wounded faster than we could treat them, the burial details working every morning to inter those who had died in the night. I moved through this landscape of suffering doing what I could, which never felt like enough, which seemed trivial compared to the work being done by brothers who still held swords and stood walls. But Brother Dominic, who had spent 20 years in the infirmary, who had seen more death than any warrior, told me something that shifted my understanding. "You think the work on the walls is more important than the work here. But consider this. Every brother who dies knowing he is not alone, who passes with prayers rather than in silence, who is tended with dignity rather than simply left to bleed out, that brother's death becomes something more than just another casualty. He dies as a knight of the temple should die, surrounded by the brotherhood he served, commended to God by those who knew him. You give them that, Brother Geoffroi. That is not small work. That is perhaps the most important work any of us does." 2 months into the siege, the walls were breached. The Saracen forces poured through a section of wall brought down by their siege engines, and the fighting moved to the courtyard, became desperate hand-to-hand combat between exhausted defenders and fresh attackers who smelled final victory. I heard the sounds from the infirmary, steel on steel, screams of dying men, the roar of warriors in bloodlust, and I felt the old instinct rise in me, the desire to find a weapon and join the fight, even though I knew my useless hands could not hold a sword. Brother Matthias appeared at the infirmary door, blood-soaked, his armor dented, his face gray with exhaustion. "They have broken through," he said. "We cannot hold them. They will reach the infirmary within the hour, will kill the wounded where they lie." He looked at me with eyes that held no hope, only grim determination. "I need you to do something, Brother Geoffroi. Something you will hate, but which must be done. The wounded who cannot walk, who cannot flee. They will be slaughtered where they lie, or worse, taken alive and tortured for information about our remaining defenses. I need you to give them mercy before the enemy reaches them. I need you to help them die with dignity rather than at Saracen hands." I understood immediately what he was asking. That I kill my own brothers, end their lives before the enemy could reach them, provide them mercy deaths rather than letting them face whatever brutality awaited. Every part of me rebelled against this task, against the idea of taking the lives of men I had sat with, prayed with, comforted. But I also understood that Matthias was right, that this was mercy rather than murder, that dying by the hand of a brother who cared for them was better than dying at the hands of enemies who had no reason to be gentle. I looked at Brother Dominic, saw the same terrible understanding in his eyes. "I will do it," I said, my voice breaking. "I will give them what mercy I can." Matthias gripped my shoulder. "This is why I did not send you away, Brother Geoffroi. Not because you could fight, but because I knew if this moment came, you would have the strength to do what mercy requires, even when doing so breaks your heart. That is service. That is keeping your oath when keeping it demands everything you have." There were 12 brothers in the infirmary, too wounded to move, too weak to flee, condemned to die whether by my hand or the enemy's. I moved among them with Brother Dominic, and we told them what was happening, what we had been asked to do, and we gave them the choice: die by our hands with prayers and dignity, or take their chances with the enemy. Every one of them chose mercy. Every one of them thanked us for the gift we were about to give them. I held each brother as Dominic administered the draught that would ease them into sleep and then into death, and I prayed over each of them, and I wept as I had not wept since I was a child. This was my service now, not glorious combat, but this terrible mercy, this act of love that looked like murder, this keeping of my oath in the hardest way imaginable. The last brother was young, barely 20, a knight who had arrived at Saft 2 months before the siege began. His name was Antoine, and he had taken a spear through the lung that had left him drowning slowly in his own blood. He gripped my useless hands with surprising strength and said, "Thank you, brother. I did not want to die alone." And I held him as the draught took effect, as his breathing slowed and then stopped, as his soul left his body, and I commended him to God with words that felt inadequate, but were all I had to give. The enemy did not reach the infirmary. Brother Matthias and the remaining defenders held them at the courtyard long enough for reinforcements to arrive from Jerusalem, for fresh knights to break the siege and drive the Saracen forces back. By the time the fighting ended, I was alone in the infirmary with 12 bodies I had helped ease into death, my hands sticky with the residue of the draughts I had administered, my prayers exhausted, my heart hollowed out by what I had done. Brother Matthias found me there, still sitting among the dead, and he did not speak at first, simply sat beside me in the silence. Finally, he said, "You kept your oath today in a way few men could. You gave those brothers mercy when mercy was the only gift left to give them. That is service, Geoffroi. That is what our vows sometimes demand, not glorious combat but terrible kindness, not the work we want to do, but the work that must be done." I could not respond, could only sit there among the evidence of what I had become, what my service had required of me. I'm an old man now, approaching 70, my hands worse than useless, my body failing in new ways each year. I remain at Saft not as a warrior, but as keeper of the infirmary, as the one who tends the wounded and prays with the dying, as the brother who provides mercy when mercy is all that remains. Young knights arrive at the fortress burning with zeal, eager to prove themselves in combat, measuring their worth by how well they fight. I watch them, and I remember myself at their age, and sometimes I tell them my story, not the parts about battles I won or enemies I killed, but the part about the day my hands failed and I had to learn what service meant when I could no longer do the work I had defined myself by. Some understand, most do not until they face their own moment of transformation, their own discovery that vows are kept not just in the ways we prefer, but in whatever ways our circumstances demand. I tell them that I was an aging Templar knight who could no longer fight, who discovered that my oath did not depend on my ability to lift a sword. That service took forms I had never imagined when I was young and strong, and certain that combat was the only work that mattered. The 12 brothers I helped die that day haunt me still. Visit me in dreams, ask me whether I did right, whether mercy was truly mercy or just the easier name for something darker. I have no good answers for them. I only know that I did what I believed was right in that moment. What my vows required when keeping them demanded I cause pain to prevent greater pain, end lives to preserve dignity. Was I right? I do not know. I know only that I kept my oath, that I served in the way I was called to serve, that I did not abandon my vows simply because my body failed, simply because the service demanded was not the service I wanted to provide. My legacy is not the battles I fought in my youth or the enemies I killed or the fortresses I defended. My legacy is the brothers who died with dignity because someone was willing to provide them mercy, the wounded who did not face suffering alone because someone sat with them, the young knights who learned from my example that vows mean something beyond personal preference, that service is sacred regardless of its form. I refused to abandon my oath when my body failed. That refusal cost me everything I thought I was, stripped away the identity I had built over 4 decades, forced me to become someone different, someone I would not have chosen to be. But it also taught me that vows are not about what we want or what feels right or what allows us to maintain our pride. Vows are about what we promised and keeping those promises regardless of cost, and finding meaning in service even when that service looks nothing like what we imagined when we were young and strong and certain that we understood what devotion required. Non nobis Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo da gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but to thy name give glory. I have lived these words in ways I never anticipated, kept my oath through transformations I never chose, served in forms I never wanted. And in that service, in that refusal to abandon what I had promised, simply because fulfilling my promise became harder than I expected, I discovered what devotion truly means. It is not glorious. It is not comfortable. It does not always let us be who we want to be. But it is enough. It has always been enough. And it will be enough when I die, and finally understand, or fail to understand, or discover that understanding was never what God required of me. Only faithfulness, only the daily choice to keep my promises, only the refusal to abandon my oath no matter how much my circumstances changed, or how completely my body failed, or how far I had to travel from the person I once believed I was.